The last thing my father ever gave me was a Tuesday. It wasn't even a meaningful Tuesday. He died on a Tuesday, and I got the call at 7:42 in the morning while I was packing my daughter's lunchbox, and I stood there with a piece of bread in one hand and the phone in the other and couldn't make either of them make sense. My name is Nora. I'm 38 years old, I teach junior year English at Millhaven High School, and until that Tuesday I had believed, sincerely and without question, that I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. I believed that right up until my mother leaned toward me at the graveside and whispered 4 words into my ear. But I should start at the beginning, because the end won't mean anything without it. My father, Gerald with his reading glasses and his flannel shirts and his habit of humming old country songs while he did the dishes, died of a cardiac event at 70 years old. That's what the death certificate said. Cardiac event. As if his heart had simply made an appointment and kept it. He'd been sick for a while. Congestive heart failure, the slow kind, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye if you use the time wisely. We had not used the time wisely. We had spent it, the way my family always spent difficult things, pretending they weren't happening. The funeral was in early November. Millhaven in November is the color of old newsprint. The cemetery sits on a low hill at the edge of town, flanked by cedar trees that give the air a sharp, medicinal quality, the smell of something trying to preserve itself. I remember the cold. I remember my daughter Lily standing beside me in her dark blue coat, the one with the brass buttons, her small hand inside mine, her fingers very still. She had loved her grandfather in that uncomplicated way that children love people who are simply kind to them without condition. She was crying quietly. I was not crying at all, which I told myself was strength, and which I now understand was something else entirely. My mother, Diane, stood across the grave. She is 67 years old and has been beautiful her entire life in the particular way of women who are aware of it, not vain, exactly, but conscious. Purposeful. She wore a black wool coat with a high collar, her silver hair pulled back, her expression composed in the way I had always admired and only occasionally found unsettling. She and my father had been married for 42 years. She was crying, or she had been, her eyes were dry by the time the pastor began to speak, and I watched her from across the lowered casket and felt that strange, suspended grief of realizing you love someone and also do not entirely know them. My Uncle Martin, Diane's younger brother, stood to her left. He's 62, heavy-set, with the same silver hair and the same composed expression, a family trait, I had always assumed. He caught me looking at him and offered a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I thought at the time that it was grief. I filed it under grief and looked away. The service lasted 40 minutes. The pastor spoke about Gerald's love of fishing and his 31 years working at the county assessor's office and his steadfast presence in the lives of people who loved him. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth, but at the time I didn't know there was a whole truth I was missing. Afterward, people gathered at the edges of the grave while the cemetery staff waited at a discreet distance. Lily had drifted toward the cedar trees, examining something on the ground, a pine cone, I think. My best friend Cassie stood a few feet behind me. Cassie, who has known me since we were 12 years old, who was standing at my shoulder the day I brought Lily home from the hospital, who has been in my kitchen more times than I can count. She was quiet that day in a way I registered but didn't examine. I had too much else to manage. My mother came around the grave and stood beside me. I expected something standard. I expected grief to speak the way it usually does, in familiar language, in the condolences people carry in their pockets for just this moment. My mother put her hand on my arm, and she leaned in close, and in a voice so low it barely cleared the sound of the wind in the cedar branches, she said, "You should know the truth." 4 words. That was all she said before Martin appeared at her elbow and steered her gently toward the waiting cars, and she let him, and she didn't look back at me, and I stood there with the cold coming up through the soles of my shoes and Lily calling to me from the cedar trees, and I could not make a single one of those things make sense. I have spent most of my life believing in the version of myself that my family needed me to be, the calm daughter, the capable one, the one who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. I had no idea, standing at that grave, how much that belief had cost me. But I was about to find out. We went back to my parents' house. My house, growing up. The one on Sycamore Lane with the wide porch and the yellow kitchen and the linoleum floor that had always curled slightly at the corner near the refrigerator. My father had meant to fix that curl for 30 years. The house was full of people in the way that houses fill after funerals, relatives I barely recognized, neighbors who brought casseroles, my father's former colleagues from the assessor's office who stood in the living room and told stories about him in low, respectful voices. I moved through all of it on automatic. I refilled plates. I accepted condolences. I kept Lily from getting into the dessert table before dinner. Cassie was there. She stayed close, the way she always does in difficult situations, and for the first hour I was grateful for her presence, the warmth of someone who has known you long enough to know when to talk and when to simply stand near you. But I noticed, sometime around the second hour, that she was watching me. Not the way you watch a friend at a funeral, with a kind of careful attention. Something more calibrated than that. Something that moved away when I turned toward it. I told myself it was grief making me paranoid. The house smelled of coffee and the carnations someone had arranged on the mantel, and underneath that, faintly, the particular smell of my childhood, something like old wood and laundry soap and whatever candle my mother had always burned in the hallway. Standing in the kitchen, watching people I barely knew eat from my mother's good china, I felt abruptly, overwhelmingly young. Not in a comforting way. My mother didn't come near me for 3 hours. I noticed this around the time the last guests were leaving. She moved through the house with perfect composure, thanking people, accepting embraces, filling the role of the grieving widow with the same efficiency she had always brought to every role she'd ever played. My mother is very good at roles. She has always been. I used to think this was grace. I had begun, somewhere in the last few months of my father's illness, to wonder if it was something closer to armor. Martin left early. I watched him go, a brief exchange with my mother in the front hallway, low voices, his hand on her shoulder, her nod. Then he was gone, and something in the set of her shoulders changed in a way I almost couldn't read. Not relief, exactly. More like the removal of a weight she'd been holding up in front of others. That night, after Lily fell asleep in my old room, I sat in the kitchen with the cooling coffee and turned my mother's 4 words over and over in my mind like stones in a pocket. You should know the truth. What truth? The truth about what? My father had just died. What could she possibly mean? I had spent years believing I was the calm one, the one who didn't need explanations, who understood without being told. That night at the kitchen table, I understood for the first time how completely that belief had worked against me. I hadn't asked the questions. Not at the graveside, not in the car, not in the kitchen. I had filed it under grief and kept moving. That was what I did. That was what I'd always done. I didn't sleep until almost 4 in the morning. I stayed in Millhaven for 5 days after the funeral. There were things to handle, paperwork, my father's belongings, the quiet administrative aftermath of death. Lily went home with Cassie on the 3rd day so I could manage things without worrying about her. I sent her off with Lily's overnight bag and a list of her medication schedule and watched Cassie's car pull out of the driveway, and Cassie looked at me through the windshield with that same careful expression I'd seen at the funeral, and then she was gone. My mother and I circled each other for 2 days. I want to be precise about this because it matters. We were not cold. We were not hostile. We were exquisitely polite in the way that people are polite when they are managing something neither of them has named yet. She made meals. I ate them. We talked about the probate process and whether to keep the house and what to do with my father's fishing equipment. We spoke about him in the past tense and sometimes stopped in the middle of sentences and didn't finish them. On the 4th evening, I set down my coffee cup and said, very quietly, "What did you mean at the grave?" My mother looked at me across the kitchen table. The fluorescent light above us hummed faintly. Outside, the November wind moved through the sycamore in the front yard with a sound like something being carefully unwrapped. She was wearing her reading glasses and she took them off very deliberately and set them beside her cup. "I wasn't sure you heard me," she said. "I heard you." She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock, a round white clock with a red second hand that my father had hung in 1989, ticked through the silence. "Not tonight," she finally said. "When?" She looked at me with something I can only describe as calculation, not unkind, not cruel, but measured. As if she were sorting through what to give me and what to keep. "There are things," she said slowly, "that your father and I agreed on together. I need to decide which of those agreements still hold." I wanted to press. Every instinct I had said to press. But that is not what I do. I have spent my entire life being the person who does not press, who waits, who accommodates, who trusts that truth will arrive in its own time if she leaves enough space for it. I looked at my mother and I nodded and I said, "Okay." Looking back now, I understand what that moment actually was. It wasn't patience. It wasn't maturity. It was the reflex of a woman who had learned, very young, that pushing cost more than waiting. That night, that reflex cost me 2 more days of not knowing something I needed to know. I couldn't eat dinner. I moved the food around the plate and my mother didn't comment and the clock kept counting. I slept badly again. Sometime around 2 in the morning I lay in the dark of my childhood bedroom, the same room where Lily had slept 3 nights ago, where I had slept for 18 years, where the wallpaper had been changed once when I was 12 from yellow daisies to a pale blue stripe, and I started cataloging things. The way my mother had looked at Martin at the grave. The way Cassie had been watching me. The 4 words, and the way my mother had let Martin steer her away before I could respond. Small things. Each one meaningless alone. Together, they had the shape of something I didn't have a name for yet. On the 5th day, my mother went to her garden club, the first scheduled thing she'd kept since my father's death, a return to routine, and I went up to the attic. I told myself I was looking for a box of Christmas ornaments my father had mentioned wanting me to have. This was partly true. The attic smelled of insulation and old cardboard and the particular dusty sweetness of stored things. It was lit by a single bare bulb on a pull chain. I moved through the boxes carefully, my mother's system, which is meticulous, labeled in her neat block capitals. Holiday. Linens. Nora school. That last one gave me pause. A box of my school things, kept for 38 years. I found the Christmas ornaments. I set them aside. And then, behind a larger box labeled Gerald office that I had to move to reach the ornaments, I found something that didn't fit my mother's system. A shoebox, plain brown, no label. Tucked back against the eave where the roofline sloped low. Placed, not stored. There's a difference. I should have put it back. A part of me knew I was crossing something. But I had not slept properly in 5 days, and my mother had told me there was a truth and then declined to give it to me, and I had spent my whole life being the person who did not press, and I was tired of that person. I sat down on the attic floor with the shoebox in my lap. Inside, documents. A folded hospital record from 1986, Millhaven County Medical Center. A letter typed on thin paper with a letterhead I didn't recognize, a law firm in Columbus. A photograph, black and white, of a woman I had never seen before holding an infant, with a date stamped on the back, March 14, 1986. My birthday is March 14, 1986. I am not going to describe, precisely, what happened inside me in that moment. Some experiences don't have language that fits them. I sat in the attic for a very long time. The light from the bare bulb was very steady. Outside, through the small attic window, I could see the sycamore tree in the front yard moving in the wind. The hospital record listed a birth. A baby girl, 6 pounds 4 ounces, born at 4:17 a.m. Mother's name, not Diane. A name I didn't recognize. Father listed as unknown. The letter from the Columbus law firm, dated April 1986, pertained to a private adoption agreement. My hands were not steady by the time I finished reading. But they wouldn't stop moving, opening things, smoothing creases, going back to the beginning of the hospital record and reading it again. I have a specific memory of the texture of the paper under my fingertips, slightly waxy, the particular feel of documents kept a long time. I did not cry. I was not yet in the part of this experience where crying was available. I had spent my entire life being the calm one. The steady one. The one who didn't need things explained because she understood without being told. I understood, sitting on that attic floor, that this was not wisdom. It was a story I had believed because my family needed me to believe it, and I had accepted that story so completely that it had become indistinguishable from my own identity. The woman who had spent 38 years being Diane and Gerald's daughter was still real. But she was not the whole truth. I put the documents back in the shoebox. I put the shoebox back behind the larger box. I carried the Christmas ornaments downstairs. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for my mother to come home. My mother came back from her garden club at 2 in the afternoon. She was wearing her gray coat and carrying a small paper bag from the bakery, a habit, bringing home something small when she'd been out, a habit I had loved my entire life. She set it on the counter and looked at me and went still. She had always been able to read me. I understood now, sitting across the kitchen table from her, that this was not the special attunement of a mother who loves her child. It was the close attention of someone who has been monitoring a secret for 38 years. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. I had planned what to say. I had spent 2 hours sitting at that table planning exactly how I would say it, carefully, with evidence, with specific questions in a specific order. Then she walked into the kitchen and I looked at her face and every plan I had made evaporated and I sat there in complete silence. Not from weakness. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was not weakness. It was the weight of the room, the kitchen I had grown up in, the clock with the red second hand, the smell of the carnations wilting on the counter, the paper bag from the bakery that she still hadn't put down, and the understanding that once this conversation happened, the kitchen would never smell the same way again. So I sat. And I let her talk. She sat down across from me. She placed the bakery bag between us. She looked at me for a long, measured moment, and then she said. The woman's name was Patricia. She was 22 years old. She wasn't able to keep you. I heard my own breathing. Your father and I had tried for 7 years, my mother continued. We went through channels we don't talk about. The arrangement was private. Legal, but private. Patricia she was from a difficult situation. She didn't want you to know. We agreed to that. She didn't want me to know, I repeated. My voice came out very flat. Not angry. Flat. She was very young, my mother said. She was frightened. And you agreed. We agreed. Silence. The clock. The second hand moving through it. Where is she now? I asked. My mother's hands moved on the table. A slight adjustment. And I saw it, the calculation I had seen before. The sorting. What to give and what to keep. I don't know, she said. She did know. I understood this with complete certainty. But there was something in her face, not cruelty, not malice, something that looked almost like protection. She was protecting something or someone. She had been doing it for 38 years and she did not know how to stop. You said at the grave that I should know the truth, I said. This is not all of it. She was quiet for a very long time. No, she finally said. It isn't. The words sat between us. I waited. She looked at me with something I had never seen on her face before, not quite guilt, not quite grief, but a third thing that lives between them, the look of someone who understands they have carried something too long and have run out of the strength to carry it further. Martin, she said. One word. But it reoriented everything. Martin. Her brother. 62 years old, silver hair, that tight smile at the grave that I had read as grief. Martin who had steered her away before she could say more. Martin who had left early. Martin who had been present at every significant moment of my life and whom I had always thought of simply as my uncle, my mother's brother, a pleasant fixture of family gatherings. He knew Patricia, my mother said. And stopped. I didn't press. Even now, Even having found the shoebox, even sitting in the wreckage of 38 years of careful architecture, I did not press. She had given me enough for the shape of it. I could see the outline. My Uncle Martin was not just my mother's brother. He was the connection. He was the reason Patricia had chosen my parents. He had known her. He had arranged it. And he had spent 4 decades maintaining the silence because it was also his secret to keep. Does he know that you told me? I said. He knows I said something at the grave. He doesn't know what. Were you going to tell me the rest? Before I found the box? She looked at me across the table, this woman who had raised me, who had kept my school things in a labeled box in the attic for 38 years, who had put a Christmas ornament on the tree every year since I was 6 months old, who had loved me in every way that she knew how, which was real and was also not the whole truth. Yes, she said. I was going to tell you everything. I don't know if I believe that. I still don't know. What I know is that something in her face when she said it looked like she had been waiting a long time to say it. We sat in the kitchen for another hour. She told me what she knew, and some of what she said I believed, and some of it I understood she was still protecting, and I sat with all of it in that flat, quiet, devastated way that is not weakness but is what happens when you're holding more than one person's worth of truth inside a body that expected a different day. That night I called Cassie. Did you know? I asked. There was a pause. Not a long one. Not even 2 full seconds. But the shape of it told me everything. Nora. How long? Another pause. Since we were in college. Your mother told me. She wanted someone you trusted to know, in case she didn't know how to say it herself. She thought if something happened. She deputized you, I said. She told my best friend instead of me. She was afraid. She asked me not to. Cassie. I stopped her. How many times did I talk to you about not knowing where I fit in my family? How many times did I tell you I felt different and couldn't explain why? Silence. Every time, she said. I know. I said goodnight. I ended the call. I sat in the dark of my childhood bedroom for a long time, in the particular silence of understanding that 2 people you love have collaborated, kindly, carefully, and with the best of intentions, to keep you from yourself. I drove home to my apartment in Columbus the next morning. Lily was waiting for me. She ran to the door in her socks, and I held her longer than necessary, and she allowed it with the generous patience of children who understand grief without being able to name it. I did not call Cassie for 3 weeks. When I did not yell. I didn't need to. I told her clearly and honestly how the deception had affected me, not only the information kept secret, but the way every conversation we'd had about belonging and identity and the feeling of being somehow outside myself had happened in front of someone who knew the answer and chose to hold it. She cried. She apologized. She meant both things completely, and I believed her completely, and I told her I needed time. Time is not the same as forgiveness. I understand the distinction now. My mother and I spoke by phone every Sunday for months. Slowly, carefully, she gave me more of the truth, not all at once, but in the way that people release things they have held very tightly, in increments, testing the air. Martin had known Patricia from a summer job in the early 1980s. Patricia had been a young woman with no support system and a pregnancy she couldn't manage. He had thought of his sister and her husband's 7 years of trying. He had believed he was doing something generous. He had not thought sufficiently about what generosity costs when it requires someone else's silence. I looked for Patricia. I want to be honest about this, because it's important. I found her. She lives in Dayton, 3 hours west. She is 60 years old. She has 2 grown children who don't know I exist. We have exchanged 3 careful emails. She is not ready for more than that, and I am learning to hold the shape of what we are, something without a name, which requires more generosity than I expected from myself. I am 38 years old, and I am, in some fundamental way, meeting myself for the first time. Not because I was adopted. That is not the revelation that changed me. What changed me is the understanding that I had spent my life inhabiting a version of myself that was constructed by other people's needs. My mother's need to be a mother without qualification, Martin's need to believe he'd done something good, Cassie's need to be trusted by both of us, my own need to be the calm one, the certain one, the one who understood without being told. I had confused all of that performance with an actual self. Rebuilding is slower than I expected. And stranger. There are days when I stand in my kitchen and notice that I don't know what I actually like for breakfast, not what I've always ordered, not what Lily prefers, but what I would choose if no one was watching. It sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Lily asked me once, about 2 months after the funeral, whether Grandma Diane was still her grandmother. I said yes. Immediately, without hesitation. Because that part is not complicated. Love doesn't require the entire truth to be real. What my mother gave me was real. What she kept from me was also real. Both things are true and neither one cancels the other. My father, Gerald, who is still my father, who always will be, died without telling me this himself. I have decided to believe he wanted to and didn't know how, rather than that he didn't care. That may be another story I'm telling myself. I think I'm allowed one. I teach The Great Gatsby every spring to my juniors. I have always focused the unit on the theme of reinvention, the idea that identity is something built rather than given, something you can choose or refuse. I used to teach this as a cautionary tale. Gatsby's reinvention destroys him. This year I taught it differently. I let the question stay open. I told my students, maybe it's not reinvention that's dangerous. Maybe what's dangerous is reinventing yourself for someone else's idea of who you should be. A girl in the third row raised her hand and said, "Then how do you know what's actually you?" I told her I'd get back to her on that. It was the most honest thing I had said in a classroom in years. There is a particular cruelty in being protected from yourself. That is what this story is really about, not adoption, not family secrets, not even betrayal in the way the word usually gets used. It's about the cost of a protection that was never asked for, built by people who loved someone so much they decided she didn't need the truth about herself. Diane and Gerald kept the secret because they were afraid. Martin kept it because confessing would have meant dismantling the version of his kindness he'd built his self-concept on. Cassie kept it because she had been deputized by a woman she respected and because breaking that trust would have meant choosing between two loyalties, and she chose the easier one. Every single person in this story who participated in the silence believed they were acting from love. That is what makes it so difficult to simply be angry. The accumulation effect here is worth examining carefully. No single decision in this story is monstrous. A young woman in a difficult situation. A couple who had tried for years to have a child. A well-meaning brother who made a connection. A private adoption, legally arranged, in 1986. Each choice, in isolation, was understandable. But every subsequent choice to maintain the silence added a layer of weight to something that was already heavy, and transferred that weight invisibly to the one person who had never agreed to carry it. Nora's flaw, the belief in the version of herself others needed her to be, was not created by her family's secret. It was shaped by it. A child raised to be the calm one, the one who doesn't press, the one who understands without being told. Those are not character traits that emerge from nothing. They are learned responses. Adaptations. The family dynamic that kept the secret also created the very personality trait that made keeping it easier. This is not accident. This is how generational patterns work, not through malice, but through the unconscious transmission of what the family requires to function. What Diane did at the graveside matters enormously. You should know the truth. 4 words spoken to her daughter as her husband was being lowered into the ground, and then immediately taken back by Martin's steering hand and her own compliance. She had carried this for 38 years and she chose the moment of maximum vulnerability to begin releasing it, and then stopped. This was not cruelty. It was the behavior of someone who has held something so long she doesn't know how to put it down all at once. She could open the door a crack. Walking through it herself was something different. The Cassie dimension is the one that cuts deepest, and it deserves more attention than it often gets in stories like this. Cassie was asked to hold a secret on behalf of someone else, about a third person who was her closest friend. She agreed. And then she spent years, while Nora described feeling like she didn't fit, feeling somehow outside herself, choosing silence over honesty. This is not a simple betrayal. Cassie was trapped by her own compliance. Having agreed to keep the secret, every subsequent conversation became an act of deliberate withholding. The longer it went on, the higher the cost of confession became. By the time Cassie might have found the courage, the deception had grown too large to dismantle with a conversation. What emerges from this, more than anything, is a portrait of how identity gets constructed in the absence of the truth. Nora was not living a lie. She was living in a real family that loved her genuinely. But something in her was always trying to reconcile what she felt, that sense of not quite fitting, with what she was told was true. That reconciliation had no resolution available to it, because the resolution required information she didn't have. So she performed her way through it. She became the calm one, the certain one, the one who understood without being told, not because that was who she was, but because that was who the situation required her to be. The final question this story leaves hanging, quietly, is the most important one: what do we owe the people we protect? And do we ever ask them? What strikes me most, thinking about this story, isn't the secret itself. It's the moment at the grave, for words whispered and then taken back. Diane had 38 years to speak and chose the worst possible moment, then lost her nerve anyway. And yet, I don't think she's the villain here. I think she's a woman who loved her daughter and was also afraid of her daughter, the way parents sometimes are afraid of the children they know they've shaped imperfectly. We are so careful with the truths we think will hurt the people we love. We guard them, file them, promise ourselves we'll find the right moment. What we rarely ask is whether our silence is protecting them, or protecting us from their reaction. How many of the silences in your life are really about someone else's comfort? And how many of them belong to someone who deserved the truth a long time ago?